Welcome to an all-new episode of Get Lit with Lianna, the podcast. Join me as I sit down with a new guest author in each episode to discuss their books, careers, and everything in between. Today I'm sitting down with romance author Kate Spencer to talk about her new book, One Last Summer. I loved getting to chat with Kate today. It centers around summer camp. So if you're like me and went to summer camp, or if you have very nostalgic memories of growing up, this book is for you. It's a second chance romance, but it has so many layers to it. It deals with incredible friendship, self-discovery, being burnt out at work, and so much more. I really loved this conversation with Kate. It was such a treat to get to talk to her and learn a little bit more about her writing background and the inspiration behind the story. So without further ado, my conversation with author Kate Spencer starts right now. Welcome, Kate, to the podcast.
Thank you.
So excited to have you here. I loved One Last Summer.
Oh gosh, thank you so much.
I'm very excited to chat about it with you because as someone who went to camp her whole life, this deeply, deeply resonated with me. So I can't wait to get into it. But before we start and we talk about this book, I would love to know a little bit more about like you and your writing background. If you could just like take me back. Obviously, this is not your first book, but I would love to know a bit more about like your writing and your kind of experience in this world.
Sure. I have been a writer, I would say, in some capacity for most of my professional life, probably for most of my life. But it took me a while to kind of figure out what my path would be as a writer. And prior to publishing books, I was an entertainment reporter. I worked for VH1 for 7 years. I had also freelanced in a few places, like Vulture, before getting a job at VH1, where I first kind of managed their website and their entertainment blog. And then I moved to Los Angeles with my family because of my husband's job. And I became a host for VH1 News. So I wasn't on like TV shows, but I would host interstitials that would run between shows. So you would see me like on a red carpet interviewing somebody, and which was very exciting. And I really enjoyed it. And after that, I was an editor-in-chief of a parenting website, and then I was a freelance writer. And so I've published in all sorts of, every place you can write. Oh, not every place. No New York Times credits for me yet, but I'm still young.
100%.
But I've written all over the place and wrote a memoir in 2017. It was published then, called The Dead Moms Club, which was about the experience of losing my mom and also just processing grief. And then my first novel is called In a New York Minute, and that came out in 2022. And One Last Summer, my second novel, just came out 2024. And I came to romance as a reader. I've been a romance reader for over a decade. And actually, what led me to reading romance was kind of discovering Twilight after becoming an entertainment writer and having to cover the first movie and the popularity of the book. And that was the first book that I could really pick up and read after my mom passed away. And so I had this experience not just of being like sucked into a fandom, but also just experiencing the power of the genre of romance. And that was like the tip of the iceberg for me. And then I like devoured everything I could find. So that is a very long answer of both how I came to this as a reader and also a writer, but I'm very happy to be here.
I love that so much. I kind of knew a little bit about your background, and like I knew that you had worked for VH1, and I know that you have like some of that celebrity entertainment background, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to connect with you, because I'm obsessed with like all things pop culture and celebrity. And I'm really curious to know what the transition for you, like mentally, I guess, or like as a writer was like from writing these like editorial pieces about entertainment or conducting interviews and then kind of using some of those skills, but adapting them, I guess, to like actually a piece of fiction.
I would say I think I love pop culture, and I was really consumed with pop culture, especially in my 20s and early 30s. And the job was perfect for me at that time in my life. But I did reach a point of kind of a pop culture exhaustion where, and I left VH1 in 2000 and I think 14. I can't 2014. So like like just the way in which pop culture has changed since
Mhm.
then is so dramatic. I mean, one of the
And the
last things I
way,
did was, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes.
no, and the way entertainment news
All of it.
has changed.
Yes.
It's so
It's wild.
remarkably different. Yeah.
So I think I like burnt out a little bit on covering celebrities. And by the time I left, I was like, oh, I'm so glad I don't have to retain like every bit of information. And I only imagine that's more intense now. But for me, actually, what a tool that I've always used in both writing kind of creative nonfiction or any journalistic piece, as well as fiction, is comes from my background in improv comedy. So I
Wait, I did not know you have a background in comedy. We have to touch upon this.
I do. I
Okay,
do.
okay.
So I am a longtime performer from the Upright Citizens Brigade.
Okay.
And I was also a teacher there. I was in their touring company. Um, and I met my husband there. It's a whole very big part of my life. I don't still perform now just because I like going to bed at like 10 o'clock. And
Fair.
improv is not a young person's game, but like a person who can like hang out late's game.
For sure.
But I still love it. But the teaching of long form, specifically long form improv comedy, the structure of the form that we learned. This is so like in the weeds, but
Yes, I love it.
that was like super clarifying to me in many ways in terms of like telling a story and heightening the story and figuring out the beats of a story. So I do think a lot of the way that I write can be attributed to being coming from this background in comedy.
So many things are like making sense to
It's
me
all
now.
percolating.
Yeah, 100%. So we have like some similarities
We have
here
parallel
in terms
lives.
of our interests, because prior to my life now, I was working in entertainment publicity for like 10 years. So I'm like so well versed in entertainment media. I mean, the Canadian landscape is so different than the American, but we were doing international stuff all the time. So I'm super, super well versed in like the movie premiere life and junkets and all of that fun stuff.
And TIFF. I mean, I came up and did
TIFF.
TIFF. TIFF is amazing.
Yes, I've done many a TIFF festival.
Many a TIFF, I bet.
Many a TIFF. And then the other part of my life, which is kind of in conjunction, is I worked at Just for Laughs, the comedy festival, for like
Oh
5
my
years.
gosh, no
6 years.
way. In Montreal?
Yes, I'm from Canada. Well, I'm from
Gosh.
Montreal originally, but I live in
Okay,
Canada
yes.
now. So I'm like so obsessed with comedy, stand-up. I know stand-up is very different than improv, but I love that you have this like comedy background. And now I feel like I need to reread One Last Summer, knowing that you have this like background, because I found the book to be like so funny and cute and like such a great rom-com. But
Oh,
now knowing that
thanks.
you have like all of these like technical learned like knowledge, I guess, from these like two worlds, it just like makes it so much richer to me as a reader. So that's such a cool thing to learn. But I would love to know like the publishing process, how you got a book deal for like, both of these books. Like, tell me what that whole world was like.
Sure. I entered publishing in kind of a unique way, just in terms of finding my agent, because I did not query.
Okay.
I was introduced to my agent through friends, and then my agent and I, she did not become my agent. She became my friend. And we realized we lived 3 blocks away from each other in Los Angeles. My literary agent is Holly Root.
Of course.
And I first met her at Comic-Con, where I was covering Comic-Con for VH1 in maybe like 2012 or 2013. I think it was 2012. And we became really good friends. And she knew I was a writer. And she always said, like, if you have something, I would love, I would love to try to support you. I can't promise you anything, but let's talk. And so when I finally wrote my book proposal for the Dead Moms Club and brought it to her. She was actually at her previous agency. She hadn't founded her own
Okay.
organization yet. But she was like, oh, I think this is something, let's work together on it. So I'm very privileged in that sense, because I didn't go through the process of querying. And I know that is a tremendously challenging experience and a really big part of it. And so I just like to like note that, right?
Mhm.
Because every writer comes into this differently. Um, and so with the Dead Moms Club, we went out to a lot of editors, and no, but people were really nice about it, and some people liked it, but I did not get a lot of like bites. And
Mm.
it took a while for that book to find its home. And that was a really it was a really challenging experience because that book is so personal to me.
Right.
And I had, I'm used to rejection in so many ways, but that was really tough, and there was a moment where I thought maybe I wouldn't get to write the book, but all it took was one editor who liked it and wanted to do it. So within a New York Minute, I had been working. I had wanted to write romance for, well, not wanted. I had been writing romance for so long, but like half, never finishing stuff, talking myself out of it. I tend to really go deep in the negative self-talk space.
Mm.
And I have ADHD as well. And so that oftentimes I now really understand the way that can kind of manifest in terms of like my creative process.
Right.
And I don't know what happened in a New York Minute, but I was just like, you have to finish a draft of this. Like it's now or never. You have a literary agent. Like you can do it. Like you're the only person stopping you is you. Kind of. I kind of had one of those talks with myself, and I managed to finish the first draft and then revise another draft. And then I worked with a developmental editor, and I really worked on the manuscript, and then I sent it to Holly, and we worked on it a little bit together, and then that went out, and that was an amazing experience, and that like Forever bought it in a preempt, and it was a 2-book deal, and it was very exciting, and it happened very fast, and it was also just kind of it was like May of 2020 when everything was just bonkers, and we were all just so isolated, and I my editor and our director of marketing Estelle, the director of marketing at Forever, were both super into the book and were just so wonderful. And that was just like a thrill, and that was also such a bright spot in an otherwise very challenging time in which I was like corralling my feral children, and it was wild.
Oh my God, I can't imagine.
So yeah, so that was that publishing deal was for 2 books. So One Last Summer is the second book in that deal.
Okay.
And that book went through a lot of revisions. And it's funny with romance because I reread the book and I'm like, this is so light that there's no way someone would read this and think it was hard to write. But
That's
when I tell you, okay, I feel, I'm like, it's a light, fluffy romance. But when I tell you that this book was a real, it really challenged me and was very trying at times. And it was, tore it down to the studs essentially many times and rewrote it over the last couple of years. So that one was a journey. Yeah.
Wow. So from like conception until its release, like how long are we talking for One Last Summer? Like how long did it take?
This camp book has been in my brain since probably 2015. Like I think I have I have notes and drafts of different iterations of a summer camp romance on my computer that are almost 10 years old. I have wanted to set a romance at a summer camp probably for my whole life. Like I always have found that to be the dreamiest, most nostalgic kind of location. But this version, I mean, the one I worked on with my editor at Forever, I mean, it was like 3 years, 2 years. It was a long time. It was a lot. Yeah. But, and it just took I think that, let me backtrack. For me as a writer, I feel like with every book, I am like, it's like taking a course on writing. I feel like I'm always learning about plot and pacing and character development and story arc and the emotional journey and the external story. Like it feels, it's educational for me every time, and it's a real learning experience. And so I really cut my teeth with this book, I think. So in the end, ultimately, it was incredibly, I feel like I learned so much. But in the moment of the learning, I was like really, gnawing my fingernails down to the quick. It was rough.
Well, it's clearly a labor of love, this book, this one for sure.
Yeah, and I also, in hindsight, was also burnt out like the main character of the book and didn't realize it. Like I didn't realize that I was incorporating my own experiences in that way
Mm.
into her story. So now
Mhm.
I can look back and be like, oh, Kate, you poor little baby. Like I see what was
Right.
going on here.
Right. So for those who have not read the book, can you just give a little synopsis about what One Last Summer is about?
Sure. So One Last Summer is, to me, a second chance romance on all sorts of levels. So it starts with our main character, Clara, who is a real kind of overachiever who really thrives in her, like identifying herself through her work. And she's kind of the last to realize that maybe she's like things aren't going so well at work as she thought they were. And her boss essentially sends her out of the office for a week and forces her to take what she calls a micro sabbatical, but is
Hmm.
basically like, you need a break. And conveniently, her Clara's friend reunion at her former sleepaway camp happens to be taking place at that same time. And so she jumps in at the last minute. She hasn't been able to go in quite a few years because of her life in Boston, but she says, F it. And she goes this year. And when they get there, they make the discovery that the camp is for sale, which also kind of throws a wrench into everybody's plans, but also really makes it the last summer that she's going to get to be with all these people at this very special place. And both the friendships and kind of her connection to this place have been kind of neglected over the years by her. So there really is this element of her coming back and reviving these relationships, these friendships, re exploring who she was when she was a younger person and who she is now. And then, of course, finally hooking up with her like longtime crush slash nemesis, who is the director of the Waterfront. He's a guy named Mac. And I should say that this also is spurred on by a letter she receives
Mm.
right after the incident at work where her boss basically, kicks her out for a week, where she receives a letter that she had written herself on her last night of camp. And her camp bestie, Sam, kept them and sent them out 20 years later. And so she's kind of confronted right away with like, oh my gosh, the person that I thought I was going to be is not who I've become.
Mhm.
What does that mean? Like, do I care? What were were my intentions at 15? Like, are are these things I still want to accomplish? Like who did I think I was going to be and who was I then? And kind of all the things we grapple with as we get a little bit older and also the realities of life sink in.
Mhm.
So it is a love story. It is a second chance love story with oneself and kind of, I think, learning to re-love yourself, but also, of course, falling in love with a childhood friend. That's always one of my favorite tropes to
Mhm.
read. So I had fun writing that part of it.
I love this book for literally every single reason you just mentioned. As I said before, I grew up going to summer camp and it's like the highlight of my life. And me and my husband always joke, we went to different summer camps. We always joke that like, could we just quit our jobs for 2 months every summer and go back? Like, what job could we do now at our camps? Like, can
I
I
mean, you
do
could. Yes,
something?
you could.
Yeah, can I do like all of like the marketing and
Yes.
what could he do? He's like, he's a theater producer. I'm like, go teach drama. Like, I don't know,
Yes.
do
He could
something.
teach theater. Oh my gosh,
We
100%.
but we like talk about it all the time. And what's so funny is that I've never like had a real itch to try to write a book like at all. But I always say that like if I were to write a romance novel, the perfect setting is sleepaway camp. So I love that you tapped into that and that you executed on this because now I feel like I don't even need to write one because I have it from you.
You do. You know what? We always need more books. So
That's
I support it. Just because I wrote one at this location does not mean it is done.
This is true.
Yes,
But
please get in there.
there's so many aspects of this book that I adored. Firstly, I love that the main character is in her 30s. I love the whole rediscovery in your 30s. I feel like that's something that's not typically touched on in romance. I mean, I feel like we're seeing a little bit more of it now, but it's definitely not the norm. So I love that that decision was made. And I also love the whole conversation around burnout and around
Mm,
people being workaholics and people obsessing over their work, either because they're running from other parts of their lives or they feel inadequate in other parts of their lives or a need for control. There's so many different reasons. And I feel like it's something that is so common amongst my friends in our early 30s that we feel that we need to continue to do more and go above and beyond because just doing what you need to do is not good enough anymore. So I'm curious why you kind of leaned in, I guess, to that notion, and like why you thought that that was a good kind of reasoning behind Clara's reason to go back to camp.
I could really relate. I think I kind of hate the term workaholic, but I used it earlier and I don't really know what another word would be, but I feel like it's a combination of things. Specifically for me as an American, like our culture is like you live to work
Mm-hmm.
and not work to live. And it is a real grind. There's a real value placed on production, productivity. I mean, not to mention like our access to healthcare is
Yeah.
tied up into our job. Like there's so many layers of it that's systemic that I didn't even like barely was able to touch on in this book, but like that I think
Right.
about a lot in terms of my own self and, just how I was raised and narratives about our family members and each other and all these things. Like that's all, it's so complex and it can be so individual as well as so universal. Not to mention relationship to finances, financial access, like all this stuff, right? For me, I think I have personally really validated myself through my work and have built my identity a lot on my work.
Mm-hmm.
And that came in and I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing. I got hired writing for VH1 like 3 months after my mom died, and that kind of really saved me in a lot of
Right.
ways. So, I think there can be wonderful benefits to a lot of this, but I also know that when I don't have the job to kind of hold up to myself as like the thing that makes me valuable, it's very scary for me to look and see like,
Mm-hmm.
well, what else of value do I have to offer?
Right.
And I think that was a lot of what Clara was doing of kind of, she had been dumped by her long-term boyfriend. And I think that kind of sent her into a place where well, I failed on that. The
Right.
one thing I can really excel at is work. And then when you find out like, oh, that's not happening either, everything I've been doing it's not working. Like I'm trying to
Right.
hold all these balls in the air and they're all falling through. Like,
Mm-hmm.
well then what is my value?
Right.
Who am I? Like what do I bring to the table? What are my qualities other than my identity as a, producer at this job? And so that was heavy in my brain, I think, because it's something I've experienced before. It's something I was kind of going through at the time. I co-hosted a podcast for 6.5 years that was really special to me. And but I started to it was a ton of it was a ton of work.
Mm-hmm.
As a podcaster, it's like not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily hard work, but it's a lot of work. And I got really fried doing it through the years, many years of COVID. And I
Right.
don't think I realized how exhausted I was until this book was coming out. And I was like, I think I need to quit the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But I almost couldn't wrap my head around that. It was like quitting a part of myself. And so that was really scary, but it all kind of collided at the same time. And I guess I credit this book and Clara for kind of helping me figure out my own stuff, because
Mm-hmm.
burnout is something I have experienced in the past. And it was kind of a surprise to me to realize like I hadn't conquered it.
Right.
I'm still going through it. It can still pop up. And I think a lot of us, especially over the last 4 years, like we have really, it's just been incredibly taxing on
For
so many
sure.
people. And I
For
and
sure.
I and I don't know if we're talking about it enough. Um and burnout can also feel kind of like embarrassing. It's
100%.
like I'm a little bit like self-conscious of like, oh wow, making a podcast was hard and you got burnout doing that. I'm hard on myself in that way. And
Yeah.
I suspect other people are too, specifically probably women.
Yes, definitely. I feel like we all need to give ourselves a little bit of like grace and understand.
Yes,
Like,
so much.
and I feel also it's just such an isolating experience. I feel like so many people think that like, why is it happening to me? It's not happening to my colleague. Like, why
Yes.
can't I keep all these balls in the air? Why can't I take more on my plate? Like, it's an isolating and like belittling feeling almost.
Yeah, totally.
But it's so, so, so common. And I know it's something I speak about with my friends all the time. One of my best friends is a social worker and she had to take some
Mm,
time off from work. And I just felt like when I felt overwhelmed with work, when I was working in entertainment PR, I was like, how can I relate my fight with a journalist in Los Angeles today with your work, which is like rehoming children who are leaving abuse situation. But the thing is, it's like every person's shit is their person's shit. Like you can't kind of compare in that way. And it's everyone is like allowed to
totally.
feel the way they want to feel and kind of just give yourself that grace to understand and recognize, okay, I'm overwhelmed and I need to take a step back. And I think that's a lot, like that's hard for
Yeah,
a lot of people. And I thought that it was interesting that in this book, it was kind of put on Clara. It wasn't kind of her decision to take the break. It was more someone else looking out for her and realizing you need to take a minute, which is
yes,
very
yes.
interesting also.
I know. And it's interesting too, because it's a little bit of like a plot device ultimately. Like, is
Right.
it as effective if she's like, I'm going to take a break? Bye. You know, there's
Right.
all that goes into writing fiction
For sure.
too. Um, but I do sometimes think often in these situations, maybe specifically with burnout, like we are often the last to realize it.
Yes.
We're the last to see it, especially if you are throwing yourself into something because you're trying to avoid other murkier feelings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it can be really scary to take the security blanket of the distraction away.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So having camp be this like serene place for her to retreat to with her friends, like tell me about that inspiration for this story. Like, why did you choose camp? Like, what's your mutual obsession with camp? Because clearly you have one.
Yeah. So I went to sleepaway camp and I tend to be a person who romanticizes everything.
Okay.
Hence like my job, but I like camp was not all I loved sleepaway camp. But it, you know, is not always like perfect or magical. It can be really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but for me, the setting of it was so idyllic, you know, to the point where like almost feels like it's just so magical.
Yeah.
Not just because I think like you're in the woods and there's a beautiful lake and gorgeous pine trees, but also because I think for many people it is a safe space away from their kind of day-to-day life and identity and
Mm-hmm.
family and community and friends and school and all those things, and is a place where you don't necessarily reinvent yourself, but you can explore other sides of yourself that maybe have been like pushed aside.
For sure.
And that was always really like powerful to me about the experience of summer camp.
Mm-hmm.
Was the things that like in my day-to-day life at home where I was like, oh, I'm not good at sports. And I never played sports at home. And then at camp, I was like always playing sports and I didn't really
Yeah.
care if I was good or not. Or, you know, I tried out for the play at camp, like just certain things
Yeah.
allowed me to kind of explore different sides and facets of myself in a really like tender, accepting community.
Mm-hmm. We used to always say like life is so much better when you're looking at it through like camp goggles. That's what
Oh
we
my
used to
gosh,
call it. And
100%.
like it was great. Like I was someone who like was so anxious all the time in the city and
Mm,
like just like the fear of missing out was my number one thing. Like I always wanted to know what everyone else was doing. And like if another, like if I made plans with someone to do something, like what if other people were doing something more fun? Or like I just growing up, that consumed me all the time.
hmm
And I loved the like relaxation of camp that like everyone's on the same schedule, everyone's doing everything together. We're all like different people here than we are in the city. And it was just like this like happy, free place. And I look back at it with like such happy nostalgia. Like I loved going to camp. And I really felt like reading this book just gave me so much like joy in reminiscing those days. And I love how in this story, Clara gets that letter from herself when she's 15, right? Is that how old she is?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
She was 15 when she wrote it.
15. Yeah. So she wrote this letter when she was 15 about all these things she hopes to accomplish by the time she's 30. And she's reading this letter and she's like, kind of not sure if she's accomplished these things. She doesn't really know. She's trying to see if can this be this? Like, can I attribute this thing to this thing? And I love how she gets the chance to kind of go back to the place where she was like her truest, happiest self and try to like rediscover that. And I love
Yes.
that she's there with these like friends and this boy that she had a crush on, but was also her enemy. And like, I love this whole cast of characters. So I'd love to know like what that was like kind of building this world for her and these characters, and especially like Mac and Sam. Obviously, they're like the two closest people to her. Like, what was that whole experience like when outlining this book or creating these characters?
It's so funny. An earlier version of this book was like, it was like a reunion of like 80 people. And I remember my editor was like, what are you like? This is going to be kind of hard. It was like a summer reunion where everybody goes to the reunion at camp. It became wild. So I had to really narrow it down. And in another version, I had a really great friend character and I had to cut her, which was very sad. But I love the idea of camp friends. To me too, often you're brought from many different like places in the world, places in life, and brought to this like one unifying place out of your other elements. And so I wanted to kind of represent that. And I also just I love writing friend groups. That's been really fun for me in fiction. And so I wanted these characters to each feel very different, but for it to then make sense that they were friends, which can be kind of hard. Like they have very different personalities and different lives. But, it reminds me of my friends who I've had since I was in like 6th and 7th grade. Like we're all super different, but the kind of unifying bond is that we have just known each other our whole lives. And that is enough. Like, it doesn't matter if we don't all like love this favorite band or like, have the same style anymore. That bond is enough. So that was kind of what I was basing that group on. Sam, I just loved the idea of somebody who you always felt like, the wise friend who then is like, I'm also scared. Like, I'm also going through life. It's not like I have everything figured out. I think oftentimes we have these friends who are like, oh, that person just knows everything. And they've always been this way. They're calm. They're this, they're that. We ascribe a lot of like characteristics to them. And which she is. Sam is Claire's best friend from camp. But she also is kind of going through, she's having a child on her own. Like it's scary. And I wanted to kind of give her space to also be afraid. And Mac, our love interest, to me is kind of like a guy that I would 100% have had a crush on. And I was able to hopefully write him in a way that he isn't a total disaster. But I feel like in real life, I would have had a crush on someone like him and it would have ended up being a total disaster. He's a little bit of like a Peter Pan man-child, he's like a Southern California kid who lives in New Hampshire and works at a summer camp. Like there's a little bit of like, he hasn't quite grown up yet, but he also is very open-hearted and caring and a good person at his core, also grappling with his own like insecurities about what he's done with his quote unquote done with his life.
Right.
So there's a lot of that.
Yes. And I know that you're a romance reader, so obviously you have your favorite tropes. And I feel like there's so many tropes, romance tropes, like peppered in this book. Like obviously it's a second chance romance. It's a friends to lovers. It's kind of an enemies to lovers too. Like what was that like when building the romantic story arc for this story? And how much fun was it for you, like being such a romance reader and such a fan of the genre and kind of playing and intertwining all of these different types of tropes?
It's funny. I never like think about the tropes when I'm writing. Although in the next book that I'm working on, I did like put a beat in where I like play around with a trope. Like you think you're going to see the trope, but then I pull it, but I don't have it happen. And this is just like to humor myself because I love tropes so much. I mean, I love, it's rare to find a romance trope that I am not super into.
Me too.
I kind of feel like I do fall as a writer a little bit into like a little too much of like, we're bickering and now we're in love, like kind of frenemies to lovers a little bit. I can see that I might be drawn to that. And I want to try to push myself like out of my comfort zone a little bit. I find that so satisfying. Like I'm always going to love like 1 minute we're fighting and the next minute we're making out. Like that kind of like the way it converges. Oh, I just like, I could eat that for dinner every night.
Me too.
Yeah, you get it.
Yes.
And then like, I think I tend to think of scenes in books as in like film, they're called set pieces, like
Yes.
big scenes.
Yes.
And I sometimes think of things in books like that, like what would be a really big, fun scene that's like visually is satisfying and it's satisfying to
Mhm.
read. And I think a lot of times then the tropes kind of come
They
out
fall
through
in.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm never like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do, like like brother's best friend,
Right.
which is another one I love. I mean,
Yes.
again, I think maybe Secret Baby I don't love, but
Hey, we are the
otherwise,
same person. I was just about to say that is
okay.
like the one that for some reason, like that just doesn't really get me, but I think I'm really for every other one.
Me
Maybe I
too.
just haven't read a great Secret Baby one. I don't
I've
know.
read a lot. I've read some good fanfic Secret Babies. I
Okay.
think I think I will be happy to read the genre. I don't know if I'm going to ever write it, but
Fair,
never say never, who
fair,
knows?
fair. And I love also kind of to go back to what we talked about before about you loving to write big friend groups. I love the way that this book in particular kind of talks about friendship and like how adult friendships serve you as you grow older. And I just think there's a lot of romance books that excel in like the love story part and the romantic love, but I love that this kind of goes beyond romantic love and the friendship love. And I would love to know like what that was kind of like and why that was something that you wanted to include in this book and why you think that that's something worth exploring in romance.
So when I wrote in a New York Minute, that main character of that book, Franny, has these like two best friends,
Mhm.
Cleo and Lola. And they're like a vital part of the book. And I loved writing their friendship. And then what was really interesting is that when that book came out, so many people commented on the friendship in that book that I was like, oh, I guess other people like it,
Mhm.
it resonated in some way that I hadn't really even meant to do, but
Right.
it was, it meant a lot to me that that was something that people were drawn to. And so I guess in the same way, I just wanted to flesh out the friend characters. I love when friend characters actually feel, oops, did I lose you? Sorry, my screen went dark. I love when friend characters feel fleshed out in
Mhm.
books, which is hard as a writer. Like it's hard to keep adding characters to your books.
For
It's more
sure.
work. Um, I don't I think it's my own life experience. I have really strong friendships, and that's just something that I really value
Yeah.
and feel like I'm also always kind of hopefully working on how to be a better friend, which is part of Clara's story too.
Mhm.
So I don't know, they just came out. I just I'm working on another manuscript right now and the friends are like much older for this main character. They're like senior citizen friends, but I'm having the same kind of fun writing them and that like I really do think community and like that kind of connection is such a vital part of our own stories that it
Mhm.
has really been meaningful for me to kind of work them in to the romance books that I write.
And you do it so, so well. I mean, I loved
That's really nice
like,
of you.
I
Thank you.
loved, yeah, no, I loved like the Clara and Sam and like all of the friendship storylines just as much as I loved the romantic storyline, which sometimes I feel isn't the case. But it like was, I just honestly, like this whole book was, I just felt like so well done. And it just like made me feel so happy and like seen. And it was just kudos to you. It was such
Thank
a
you so
good book.
much. I
Yes,
really
loved it.
appreciate it. I like honestly, I think all writers experience a lot of self-doubt and so there have been a
Mhm.
lot like it means a lot to me to for people to even be reading this book because it was something that I just had for myself for so long. So that's
Yeah.
really, really lovely to hear. I really appreciate that.
Of course. So I know you kind of said before that this was a two-book deal, and then
Yes.
you mentioned that you're writing some other things. So I would love to know, I don't know what you can share, but whatever you are allowed to share or feel like you could share, I know people will love to know what we can expect coming down the pipeline for you, not to rush you, because I know
Oh
we are like
no.
literally just a few days out of One Last Summer being
Oh, I'm on a
published. But
deadline that's
oh,
happening at
okay.
the same time as this book coming out. So it
Thank you.
hasn't this my next book hasn't been announced yet. So
Okay.
I like like formally announced.
Okay. Okay. That's
So
fair.
I don't think I can share much,
Okay. But there is
but
another book.
please know I am working on another book that will hopefully be out. I think I'm not quite sure actually. I shouldn't say when it'll be out. I don't know if it'll be out in a year or a little bit longer, but I am writing a romance book. Um it's different than anything I've written before. It is still contemporary romance. It's steamier than anything I've written before.
Okay.
And I mean, we'll see what stays in the final version.
Right.
This is still in a draft form. But I'm having a lot of fun with it. And as soon as I'm able to share, I will. I like truly don't know what I'm allowed to say and not
Okay,
allowed
that's
to say.
fine. That's
That
totally
sounds
fine.
so vague and annoying, but it's more just like I am also a people pleaser who doesn't want to make anybody mad. So that's
100%.
more why I'm
No.
being vague.
Okay, well, that seems very intriguing. And I hope that when that book is out, you will come back, especially if there are elements of steam. I love talking about intimacy and steam.
Ooh, I
And
would love that.
I would love to have another conversation with you and kind of do a deep dive in that, provided
Thank you. I would be
would love to.
honored.
Okay, amazing.
Oh my gosh, I would love it. And I read a lot of steam. So
Okay.
like it's for me to try to dip a little bit of my toes for that sounds so gross. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Get a little steamier.
Yeah,
It has been like fun, but also it like makes me blush. It's like, I'm still such a,
I know.
big baby.
I know. I
But,
hear you. It's
but
like
I'm a
an
smut. I like
awkward.
a heavy smut.
Yes, yeah, same. I love to read smut. It's my passion, honestly.
Yeah, same. I mean, hard. That's like what I read is often different from what I write. So
I love that.
I'm happy to get a little steamier.
And I'm sure it's like a fun exercise for you to do something a little different. But let's save that conversation for next time. I can't wait to get into it. But thank you so, so much for taking the time to chat. This was incredible. I love your book. And I know everyone else, is loving it that I've seen so far. So congratulations, because
Thank you.
Fabulous.
I really appreciate you having me, and I love getting to have these conversations. So thank you so much for welcoming me on the show. It means a lot.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure.